Hi, my name is Jenny McConnell, and I was one of the drivers on the London-New York Overland Challenge.
This man had a dream: to take an international team across the world from London to New York overland, through the unknown Siberian deep freeze and across the treacherous Bering Straits. His dream became a reality on this amazing journey overland to America.
Tried to save it yesterday when the engine stops. Oh, but let's go! It's great, the car driving to New York. I'm very excited.
And to give it to you, United Nations here in New York.
Being part of that team, I was actually selected through the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. I was doing my gold through a centre in Belfast called Belfast Activity Centre, and I was lucky enough to be selected. The Overland Challenge was a dream and a vision created by one man, Richard Creasy, who was our leader on the expedition, and he really saw through his partnerships and the relationships that he'd built up and his experience of travelling that a drive could be achieved through London to New York.
I'm Richard Creasy, and I was the expedition leader, and I was director of factual programmes for 2 television companies. But when I started, the environment was at square one, and I was trying to do something which would get a big enough attention to see that people could work together on a journey across the world. I was responsible for about 400 programmes a year, and I knew what people watch and what they don't, and I knew this would be good television.
And that was really facilitated by starting off in London, going through the Channel Tunnel. We were the first to drive through the Channel Tunnel. It wasn't even open at that stage. We went through the service tunnel.
And then I had to persuade the Channel Tunnel to let us drive through it, which no one had ever done before. And they wouldn't want it open because you'd go by train. So I managed to get the chairman of the Channel Tunnel to agree, and on his agreement I got Ford on board. So the United Nations came on board, but they made a condition which was not what I expected, but turned out to be great. They said, you can come on board, you can do this project and have it formally endorsed by the United Nations, on the condition you have 10 different countries involved. So on your team you have to have people from 10 different nationalities, right, and 10 different areas. So that completely changed things. I had to massively increase the number of cars we'd use, the number of support we'd have, but I suddenly had an international team representing the idea of bringing the world together.
You know, we drove along frozen rivers for days. We actually got stuck up in the Arctic, where we were very lucky that we had one Russian fixer who really pretty much saved our lives, because he got us through a very deep Arctic fog, and the conditions were horrendous. And we actually had to go off our navigated plan further up into the Arctic. And at that stage in Siberia, we had maybe 6 or 8 Ural trucks, and we had several Mavericks. So it was a big convoy. And, you know, this fixer had his head out the window trying to see through the fog and navigate us to safety. There were severe conditions and our food stocks were starting to run low. We had a driver who had a suspected heart attack. We had a doctor with us as well, and he was able to manage that situation. But for a while up in the Arctic, that was getting quite scary.
Jenny, who is very instrumental in getting the car to the museum, was part of that because she was the youngest person on the team, which worked as one block. Getting through what, to be fair, was atrocious conditions. I mean, for about 2 months, we were in minus 40.
I can remember going from along the convoy with food for everyone, and you were you had to be really careful between the trucks, which were only maybe 2 metres wide in distance. But you had to be so careful because the winds, it was 104, minus 104 with wind chill. And it was a whiteout. So had I have been caught by the wind, or anybody caught by the wind, you may not have been found again. We were in a place called Omicon, which is the coldest place, where the coldest temperature in the world has been recorded. I think it's I think it was recorded at 59.7, minus 59.7. And when we were there, it was in and around that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But I do remember there was issues with some of the cars, and the mechanics were very concerned because the temperatures were, so extreme. But our mechanic team from Ford, headed by a chap called Paul Wilson, were truly amazing at keeping those cars going. I drove both. We had the Ford Mondeos up to a period of time. We dropped them off before the snow and ice conditions got too severe, really, while they were 4x4 prototypes, there was, when you're dealing with this amount of snow, there's only so much that the car can do. And we had to switch to the off-road 4x4 Mavericks.
The Mondeo was the most popular Ford. And so the idea of, when I was able to go there, I could say, let's do one which is a global journey, which is the longest journey you'll ever be able to drive, which is London and New York, and that's how I got Ford to say yes. They were ordinary family saloons, basically, a good four-wheel job, which it was going to be a global car. But when you look at the inside, the 3 Ford mechanics who had been given to us for 3 months before the journey started, and throughout the entire journey, they simply took all the insides out and put back in again. So they put in special heaters, they put four-wheel drive, they had as many of the fuel taps as they could, were taken from outside, inside, so they would keep warm when they were driving as opposed to freeze. So they did all they could, and indeed did lots of research on them up in Sweden, and we did practice in Sweden driving the cars around. We shipped them from Magadan, so we never got them to go up the Colomar River. And instead we took the Ford Mavericks, which could be towed and jockeyed along. And when you look at that car, most people say it can't get across Russia in minus 50. Well, actually it did. And having the car, L1, in the museum, the only one, is pretty extraordinary. And most people say it's a Mondeo. It was a Mondeo to look at, but it was the only one of 3 made as prototypes which had four-wheel drive. So you've got the absolutely greatest one. It's completely unique, and there is no other car with the four-wheel drive.
Some of us were airlifted across the Bering Straits because the 2-pod amphibious vehicle known as the Arctos couldn't take the full crew, and there was only a number of people who could go on the Arctos. Now, the Arctos actually didn't make it across. The Bering Straits are notorious for ice movement, and while it was thought that the vehicle could navigate it, the movement of the ice through the Bering Straits, particularly through Little Diomede and Big Diomede, is so ferocious that it's very, very hard to navigate. And in fact, I don't believe anybody has crossed that area successfully ever. So we were heli-lifted over to Alaska, over to the edge of the Bering Straits, and then made our way down to Nome, which is where we stayed for a while until the rest of the team could match up with us.
What happened was we got to the very edge of Russia when I was met by this huge vehicle called the Arctos, which was a peculiar machine which looks like 2 World War I tanks put together. And I was absolutely sure that it would happily transport us across the Bering Straits. Then I got slightly more feedback. I hadn't seen it myself, from one of our logistics people who went to see it and said, "Richard, it's small. It's not going to take everyone." Which then, for 3 weeks before we got to the Bering Strait, took up all my mind, who does go? The Arctos, within 6 hours, maybe it was 8, quite clearly would never make it.
We arrived in Nome in Alaska, picked up skidoos from there, scooted right from the edge of the Bering Straits down to Fairbanks. And then we picked up the Mavericks from there, and then we drove all the way through Canada and down into New York.
But in the second part of the journey, we were on snowmobiles. And snowmobiles are really cold. I personally found it awful. Jenny loved it. She was there in her snowmobile, and actually some of the best parts is watching her face. You could see it was Jenny bouncing around, loving every bit as the 21-year-old charging across Canada and Alaska.
And I just whammed that throttle on, and it was going all over the place, and I was jumping up, and I think at one stage I nearly fell off. And I just whammed it up. Did you see that?
Yes, I did.
And I just came up here and just gave Art a big hug, and my legs were shaking like mad. It's like doing your first abseil. Your legs are going ding, and then you get down, and it's just fantastic. Such a good feeling. Oh, that was brilliant. These things can move, Larry.
Ural truck was shipped into a location in New York where they could be part of the convoy coming in. So it was lovely that when we drove into New York, we had the Mavericks, the Mondeos and the Ural trucks, full team. And finally arrived in the UN headquarters on the 5th of April. When we were coming across the bridge into New York, helicopters were right level with us, filming us coming in. And also there was loads of big vans, minivans with film crews hanging out the side, trying to get our view, because our convoy had to be tight. So you could see the New Yorkers going, what's going on? As these big Russian Ural trucks were coming through and then arriving in the UN headquarters. So everybody in the team was so excited at that point, because we'd reached our end point. We'd achieved something that hadn't been done before, and we'd realised somebody's dream.
Oh, this is just absolutely amazing. My legs nearly started to shake again. Absolutely best day. Fantastic.
The whole adventure was enabled by a number of key things. Technology had advanced in the 90s to a point where obviously the Channel Tunnel had been built. So we were able to scope that piece out through being overland. Historical and political context had changed. And that was really, really important, because there wasn't such a frosty political sort of environment between East and West. There was many, many partnerships had been built up in this global understanding of a more globalised world. And that was so contextually important to actually being able to do such a far-reaching and visionary expedition. The way the trip was planned by Richard and the team was very much about engaging with local communities. So whenever we arrived at different communities, the Russians were there to meet us. They often gave us gifts, some of which I've donated to the museum. And it was overwhelming, the sense of humanity, the sense of kindness, collaboration. I think that is something that really stayed with me. We were being filmed, and Case, our cameraman, was with us the whole way through. And he then was responsible for sending back the rushers. So there would be helicopters meeting us along the way, sending back the film rushers, because they had to be manually transported. And then they had to go back into London to be edited and sifted through. And then a programme had to be put together. And that happened every week throughout the entire challenge. There wasn't anything about sending, the films through. It had to be manually brought over, because, and I suppose now, technology has changed so much. How that is done is very, very different. But in those days, it was a fabulous logistics achievement as well. It was more exciting, because it literally was every week. Where are they now? Where have they got to? And we like to think we led the way in that event television and adventure travel. Because, as I say, it was before the times of mobile phones. There was no texting or WhatsApping or picture sharing. It was literally just keep driving and get to the goal. At the age of 21, to be invited I'm selected to do a round the world expedition, going through the Channel Tunnel, going all the way across Western Europe into Eastern Europe, going across the Bering Straits, skidooing across Alaska, driving across Canada and getting into the UN headquarters. It's had such an impact on my life, and I feel so privileged to have experienced working as part of such a unique and global team. I was the youngest member of the team and the youngest person to circumnavigate the world at that time, I believe.
Jenny's role, she was one of those great members of the team, like all of them, but she stood out as the youngest member and always remembered to me as Jenny was 21 when she came on board.
Kids just need to seize the opportunities. Just welcome the opportunities, grab them, take them to where they can go and enjoy them.
That every single person is given a choice as to whether they say yes or no. If you know you can do it, if you want to do it, always say yes. This is a trip in which a number of different people, ordinary people, drove across the world and they've never done it before. And this is a trip about that.
And I think it's tremendous that we have a car here in Northern Ireland that took part in a global expedition that I was part of, that, hopefully my grandchildren can come and see. And the story, the historical story, the political story, and the technological story can be shared with so many in a way that embraces thought and allows other people to understand what went back on in the challenge and how it came about.